There is a problem with the Rockefeller origin story that the official biography handles the same way it handles all problems, by moving past it quickly and filling the space with a more comfortable narrative. The problem is the gap between what the documentary record shows about the Rockefeller family before 1858 and what the documentary record shows about them after 1865. That gap is not the gap between a poor family and a wealthy one, which is the story the official biography tells. It is the gap between a family that essentially does not exist in any meaningful financial record before a specific date, and a family that, within 1 decade of that date, controlled the most consequential industrial infrastructure in the Western world. The speed of the transition, and the specific historical context in which it occurred, does not fit the story of a self-made man building from nothing. It fits a different story, one that the official account of American industrial history has never seriously attempted to tell. I want to start with what the record actually shows, because the record is the thing, not the mythology constructed around it, not the biographies written with the cooperation of the Rockefeller family archives, not the university endowments and cultural institutions that have been making the case for Rockefeller greatness since the 1890s. The record itself. William Avery Rockefeller, the father of John D. Rockefeller, appears in the historical record as an itinerant trader and patent medicine salesman operating in upstate New York and the Midwest during the 1840s and 1850s. He called himself a botanic physician, sold herbal cures and cancer remedies from a wagon, and was documented in a warrant for the charge of rape in Cayuga County, New York, in 1849. He eventually abandoned his family in the early 1870s and lived out his remaining decades under the assumed name William Livingston in South Dakota. He died in 1906. His estate at death was negligible. This is the paternal inheritance of the man who would become the wealthiest person in the history of the world by virtually every inflation-adjusted calculation. A traveling medicine show operator who was charged with rape and eventually abandoned his family under a false name. The origin story that the official Rockefeller biography offers is that John D. Rockefeller's wealth was the product of his own disciplined industry and commercial genius, built from a position of modest beginnings through the application of ruthless but legal business practices to the emerging oil industry of western Pennsylvania. The modest beginnings are documented. John D. Rockefeller was born in 1839 in Richford, New York. He moved with his family to Cleveland in 1853. He found work as a clerk at a produce commission house in Cleveland in 1855 at the age of 16. He left that position in 1858 and, with a partner named Maurice Clark, established a produce commission business of his own using, according to the official account, $4,000 borrowed from his father and $1,000 of his own savings. $4,000 in 1858 is approximately $130,000 in current terms. A 16-year-old clerk at a produce commission house in Cleveland in the 1850s was earning approximately $300 to $500 per year. In 3 years of employment, such a clerk could not have accumulated $1,000 in savings without extraordinary frugality or supplemental income from sources not documented in any record. The $4,000 from his father is even more difficult to account for, but given that William Avery Rockefeller's documented income from patent medicine sales in the same period is not consistent with having $4,000 available to lend to a son in 1858. The produce commission business established in 1858 prospered, and in 1863 Rockefeller and Clark entered the oil refining business in Cleveland, establishing a partnership with a refiner named Samuel Andrews that would become, within 7 years, the Standard Oil Company. The transition from a modestly successful produce commission merchant to the owner of the largest oil refining operation in the United States, completed within approximately a decade and a half of the initial business formation, is the central mystery of the Rockefeller financial record. The Standard account attributes this transition to Rockefeller's commercial genius, his systematic approach to reducing costs, his willingness to negotiate with railroads for rebates that gave Standard Oil freight advantages over competitors, and his organizational innovation in creating the trust structure through which Standard Oil consolidated the American oil industry. All of these elements are documented. What is not documented in any satisfactory form is the source of the capital that enabled them. Building an oil refinery in 1863 required significant capital. Acquiring additional refineries in Cleveland during the early 1870s, which Rockefeller did with a speed that his competitors found impossible to match, and that they described in congressional testimony as clearly backed by capital resources that no Cleveland produce merchant could have accumulated through legitimate means, required even more significant capital. The railroads with whom Rockefeller negotiated his famous rebate arrangements did not enter those negotiations because Rockefeller was a charismatic salesman. They entered them because Rockefeller was moving a volume of product that made him commercially significant, and moving that volume required capital that the official record does not adequately account for. The congressional investigation of 1872, which examined the South Improvement Company, the predecessor arrangement to the Standard Oil Trust, and documented the scale of what Rockefeller had built with a clarity that the investigating committee itself found difficult to account for. Committee members, several of whom were experienced businessmen, expressed in the record their specific puzzlement at the speed with which a Cleveland-produced merchant had acquired the capital and the railroad relationships to construct what was already the most powerful commercial arrangement in the American oil industry. The answer that the official biography provides to this puzzle is Rockefeller's disciplined reinvestment of profits. Every dollar earned was reinvested rather than consumed, compounding the growth of the enterprise. This explanation is plausible in principle, and it is the explanation that Rockefeller himself consistently offered in his own memoirs and interviews. It is not adequate to account for the specific timeline and scale of what the record shows. The capital that established Standard Oil's dominance in the American oil industry in the period from 1870 to 1879, when the trust structure was formally established, came from somewhere. The somewhere that the official biography identifies is insufficient by the arithmetic of what the documented income sources could have produced in the relevant period. The somewhere that the Tartaria research community has been pointing at for several years, and that the conventional historical record has never seriously examined, is the 1858 to 1865 period, and the question of what was happening in the American economy in that specific window. That window is the Civil War. The Civil War is the context in which the Rockefeller financial mystery, if it is a mystery, is most productively examined. Because the Civil War was not only a military conflict, it was the largest single redistribution of economic resources in American history to that point, occurring within a specific window, producing winners and losers at a speed and scale that had no precedent, and doing so through mechanisms that the official history of the period has documented only selectively. The Produce Commission business that Rockefeller and Clark established in 1858 did not merely prosper during the Civil War. It prospered at a rate that produced commission merchants in Cleveland found extraordinary, and that the surviving business records from the period, to the extent they are accessible, do not fully explain by reference to the volume of legitimate produce trade flowing through Cleveland in the relevant years. Cleveland was a significant distribution point for agricultural produce moving east, and the Civil War created unusual demand for foodstuffs in quantities that could make a well-positioned produce merchant wealthy. This much the official account acknowledges and uses to explain Rockefeller's capital accumulation. What the official account does not examine with any seriousness is the nature of the government contracting relationships that the most successful Cleveland produce merchants of the Civil War period maintained, and whether Rockefeller and Clark were among the contractors supplying the Union Army in ways that would have provided capital accumulation at rates significantly in excess of what the legitimate produce trade alone could produce. Government contracting during the Civil War was a notoriously corrupt and profitable enterprise. The congressional investigations of war profiteering that occurred during and after the war documented a systematic pattern of overcharging for military supplies, of phantom deliveries for which payment was nonetheless received, and of kickback arrangements between supply contractors and the purchasing officers of the relevant military departments. The Rockefeller and Clark Partnership's contract records from the Civil War period are not fully accessible in any public archive. The Rockefeller Family Archives at the Rockefeller Archive Center in Sleepy Hollow, New York, contain extensive documentation of Rockefeller's business activities from the mid-1860s onward. The documentation from the 1858 to 1864 period is, by the standards of the archive's later holdings, sparse. This sparseness may reflect the record-keeping practices of a young business. It may also reflect what was available to be preserved, curated, and made accessible by an institution that has had a century of experience managing the historical record of one of the most powerful families in American history. The question of what the Rockefeller Archive Center has chosen to make accessible and what it has chosen to restrict is not a paranoid one. It is a question about institutional practice that applies to every family and corporate archive in existence. Archives curated by the subjects of that archival record are inherently selective. The selection reflects the institutional interests of the curating entity. The Rockefeller Archive Center is a sophisticated scholarly institution that has supported important historical research. It is also an institution that was created by and continues to be governed by the Rockefeller family interests it documents. The histories that have been written with its cooperation and from its holdings are not fabrications. They are necessarily histories written from a selection of the available record. The selection missing from the official account is the selection that would answer the capital question. Where did the money come from that established Standard Oil's dominance from 1860 to 1875? The official answer is insufficient. The alternative, that the capital came from sources connected to the Civil War and its aftermath, from government contracts, from the redistribution of resources that accompanied the war and the Reconstruction period, from connections to the financial networks simultaneously establishing themselves in New York, is an answer the documentary record gestures at without making explicit. The Tartaria research framework offers a more radical alternative, and it is worth engaging with seriously rather than dismissing, because the questions it asks about the Rockefeller financial mystery are legitimate questions, even if the specific answers it proposes are not confirmed by the documentary record in the way that the Civil War capital hypothesis is. The Tartaria framework proposes that the emergence of enormous fortunes in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s across multiple industrial sectors, not only the Rockefeller oil fortune, but the Carnegie steel fortune, the Morgan banking fortune, the Vanderbilt railroad fortune, and a cluster of others that appear in the historical record within a specific and limited time window, represents not the natural emergence of commercial genius applied to industrial opportunity, but the redistribution and redeployment of a pre-existing stock of wealth and infrastructure that was not created by the people who came to control it. In the Tartaria framework, the great American industrial fortunes of the post-Civil War period were assembled from assets, including physical infrastructure, financial instruments, and control over specific commercial networks that had belonged to a prior civilization or a prior order that was disrupted or destroyed in the mid-19th century, specifically in the period that the Tartaria researchers identify as the reset, the disruption of the pre-existing order that cleared the field for the industrial capitalists who came to dominate the late 19th century. The specific evidence that Tartaria researchers cite for the Rockefeller case is the same evidence that motivates the capital question in the conventional historical framework, but interpreted through a different explanatory lens. The speed of Rockefeller's rise, the scale of capital he was deploying within years of entering the oil industry, the relationships he already had with the railroad interests and the banking interests by the early 1870s, the way he navigated the political landscape in ways that suggest familiarity with power structures that a Cleveland-produced merchant encountering them for the first time would not have possessed. Even these are anomalies that both the conventional analysis and the Tartaria framework identify. They differ in the explanation they offer. The conventional explanation is luck, genius, and the specific opportunity presented by the American oil industry at the moment of Rockefeller's entry. The Tartaria explanation is inheritance of a different kind, not the personal inheritance from William Avery Rockefeller, the patent medicine salesman, but access to resources and networks connected to a pre-existing order that was being reorganized in the 1850s and 60s. What gives the Tartaria explanation its traction in the actual historical record beyond its internal logic as a framework is the specific pattern of what happened to American institutional life in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, the period immediately before the great industrial fortunes appear. The public buildings of American cities in this period, the government buildings, the financial institutions, the civic structures, I show in their architectural scale and in their construction economics the same anomaly that the Tartaria research community has documented across the world. Buildings that are too large, too precisely constructed, and too inexpensive by the documented record to have been built from scratch using the technology and the labour markets of their supposed construction date. The Standard Oil headquarters in Cleveland, the buildings that Rockefeller commissioned and occupied in the period of the company's maximum power in the 1880s and 90s, are not the buildings that exhibit the anomalous proportions, but the context in which Standard Oil operated, the railroad network that it depended on, the financial infrastructure of the banking system that capitalized it, the government institutions that regulated and in many cases facilitated its growth were themselves embedded in a physical infrastructure that the Tartaria research framework identifies as potentially inherited rather than constructed by the civilization that used it. The railroad network is the most significant of these. The American railroad system that Rockefeller's rebate arrangements depended on was, by the late 1860s, the most extensive in the world, built from essentially nothing in the 1830s to a continent-spanning network within 3 decades. The Tartaria research community has noted that the specific engineering of this infrastructure, the gradient management, the bridge construction, the tunneling through mountain ranges, reflects technical capabilities that are not entirely consistent with the documented state of American engineering science in the period of the construction. This is a claim that mainstream historians dispute with reason. The engineering achievements of the early American railroad are not necessarily impossible for the period, accomplished at significant cost in human life, with techniques developed through the process of the construction itself. The Tartaria framework's claim that they reflect inherited technical knowledge is not proven by the engineering evidence alone. But the question it raises, whether the infrastructure context within which the great American industrial fortunes emerged was itself a product of prior development being reorganized rather than built from nothing, is a question worth holding alongside the specific financial mystery of the Rockefeller fortune. The specific period of 1855 to 1865 is the period in which the alignment of several historical trajectories produces the most concentrated anomaly in the American financial record. The industrial fortunes that would define the next century of American economic life did not merely emerge in this period. They emerged with a speed, a coordination, and a scale that suggests the mobilization of pre-existing resources rather than the accumulation of new ones from commercial activity. John D. Rockefeller entered the oil industry in 1863. B. Andrew Carnegie had been accumulating capital and relationships in the Pittsburgh railroad and telegraph businesses since the 1850s, and would begin building Carnegie Steel in the early 1870s. J.P. Morgan had begun his banking career in New York in 1857 and would establish the financial relationships that made both the Carnegie Steel empire and the Rockefeller oil empire possible. Cornelius Vanderbilt, who had been accumulating wealth in the steamship business since the 1820s, pivoted to railroad consolidation in the 1860s with a speed and a success that, like Rockefeller's oil consolidation, exceeded what the documented capital base of his steamship operation could have funded without external sources. Why, these are not simply stories of great men responding to industrial opportunity. They are stories of a coordinated reordering of the American economy within a specific and limited time window, producing a structure of industrial and financial control that would persist for over a century. The coordination is not documented in any explicit form. There is no record of Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgan, and Vanderbilt meeting to divide the American economy among themselves, but the pattern of their activities, each occupying a specific sector, their interests supporting rather than competing with each other in the critical formation period, their relationships with specific political figures in Washington giving them access to the federal policies that facilitated their consolidation, as suggests a coordination that the conventional record attributes to coincidence and complementary interests. The Rockefeller philanthropic apparatus, built from the 1890s onward and accelerating after Rockefeller's retirement from active Standard Oil management in 1911, is itself a data point in how the origins of the great industrial fortunes were managed in the historical record. The Rockefeller Foundation, established in 1913, funded not only medical research and educational development, but also the historical scholarship that documented the emergence of American industrial capitalism. The historians who wrote the first generation of major academic studies of Standard Oil were working in a period when the Rockefeller philanthropic apparatus was the most significant private funder of academic research in the United States. This does not mean those historians fabricated their findings. It means the questions they asked were shaped by the intellectual environment in which they worked. The questions that would have required answers about the pre-1860 capital sources, about the Civil War contracting relationships, about the specific nature of the arrangements with the railroad interests in the early 1870s, were not the questions they focused on. They focused on the period of Standard Oil's mature operation. The origin story was accepted as given. The gap before 1858 was not examined with the rigor it warranted. The Tarbell investigation, published in McClure's magazine between 1902 and 1904, addressed the operational mechanisms of Standard Oil's monopoly with extraordinary thoroughness. Tarbell had personal reasons for it. Her father's oil business had been destroyed by Standard Oil's consolidation tactics in the 1870s. Her investigation documented the rebate system, the predatory pricing, the railroad pressure, the industrial espionage, and the political corruption Standard Oil employed to maintain its dominance. It did not investigate the origins of the capital that had made Standard Oil possible. The capital question was not her question. The origin of the resources behind the methods remained unexamined. The record that exists for the pre-1860 Rockefeller family is not entirely blank. It contains the documented facts about William Avery Rockefeller's patent medicine business, the family's moves through upstate New York, John D. Rockefeller's education at the Cleveland Commercial College, his employment at the produce house, his early savings. What it does not contain is any documentation that coherently connects those modest origins to the capital deployment that begins in 1863 and accelerates through the following decade. The connection is assumed rather than demonstrated, bridged by the explanation of genius and reinvested profits that is stated repeatedly in the official accounts, but that does not withstand arithmetic scrutiny when applied to the specific timeline and capital scales involved. The arithmetic is not complicated, it is simply not done. The official accounts do not attempt to reconcile the documented income sources of the 1858 to 1865 period with the capital being deployed in the 1863 to 1870 period. The reconciliation is left to the reader's trust in the genius narrative. The genius narrative is not without factual basis. John D. Rockefeller was by every documented account extraordinarily competent, disciplined, and organizationally innovative. These characteristics explain a great deal about what Standard Oil became once it was underway. They do not explain where the capital came from that made it possible to get underway. The Rockefeller Archive Center's holdings from the pre-1865 period are the documentary gap that, if fully illuminated, would either resolve the capital question or deepen it. The archive's own guides note that the early business records are incomplete. This is not unusual for an archive spanning a century and a half, but the incompleteness of the record from the specific period that would answer the most consequential question about the Rockefeller fortune has been treated as an unfortunate archival limitation rather than as an invitation to investigate through other means. The other means exist. The Cleveland City directories from the 1860s document the business addresses, partners, and commercial activities of firms in that city during the period when Rockefeller's capital was accumulating at its most anomalous rate. Congressional records from the Civil War contracting investigations document at least partially the names of contractors supplying the Union Army through Cleveland. The railroad company records from the early 1870s document the specific freight arrangements Standard Oil was negotiating before the trust structure was formalized. None of these sources has been systematically analyzed to address the capital question. The question has simply not been asked with the seriousness that the arithmetic demands. The buildings are still there. The foundations of Standard Oil's industrial dominance are still visible in the corporate structures, the financial relationships, and the physical infrastructure of the American economy that emerged from the late 19th century. The gap in the record before 1858 is still there. The arithmetic that the gap represents is still available to anyone who wants to do it. And the questions that the Tartaria framework raises, questions about the speed and coordination and capital scale of the great American fortunes' emergence in the specific post-Civil War window, are questions that do not require acceptance of the Tartaria framework's specific historical claims to be worth asking. The archives hold what they hold. The Rockefeller Archives Center holds what it holds. The congressional records from the Civil War contracting investigations hold what they hold. The Cleveland City directories from the 1860s hold what they hold. The railroad freight records from the early 1870s hold what they hold. None of these sources has been interrogated from the specific angle of the capital question with the rigor that the arithmetic of the Rockefeller fortune demands. The official scholarship has been written to explain what happened once the fortune was established. The question of how the fortune was established, specifically where the capital came from, in the window between 1858 and 1865, has been answered with a narrative that does not withstand arithmetic scrutiny, and that has been accepted without scrutiny by the institutions whose funding has shaped the scholarship. The philanthropy, the university endowments, the medical schools, the public libraries, the museums, the think tanks, the policy institutes, the media organizations, the academic departments, the research programs that the Rockefeller philanthropic apparatus has funded since the 1890s are not irrelevant to understanding why the capital question has not been asked. They are the infrastructure of the answer's suppression, not through conspiracy in the thriller sense, but through the mundane mechanism of funding questions that are compatible with the funder's interests and not funding the questions that are not. The Rockefellers had no recorded wealth before 1858. Then they owned everything. No official account has adequately bridged that gap. The bridge the official account provides is made of genius and reinvested profits. The arithmetic of the timeline does not support the load. The record is there, the arithmetic is there, the gap is there. What is missing is the will to ask the question the arithmetic demands, without the pre-commitment to the official conclusion that has characterized every previous attempt to tell this story.